The wind hit the SS London broadside and stayed there, a wall of water and sound that turned the deck into a wet anvil. Spray blew level with the rail. Voices rose and fell in fragments, orders, prayers, the scrape of boots, while a hymn gathered at the break of the poop where the passengers clung to the spars for shelter. In the Bay of Biscay, the January seas came green, black, and mountainous, lifting the ship, dropping her, then throwing whole rooms of water aboard. A bell rang somewhere below and went silent. The London's funnel coughed smoke into the gale, then only steam, then nothing. The ship had sailed from Gravesend at the very end of 1865, bound for Melbourne under Captain John Martin. She was a modern steamer with auxiliary sail, a veteran of the Australian run, and she had a reputation for speed. This time, though, she sat low. Railway iron filled her holds. Coal had been stacked on deck to feed the long engine hours ahead. People in the river towns watching her pass muttered that she looked too deep for weather. In the channel, she caught heavy wind and ducked into shelter, first at Spithead, then Plymouth, before pushing out again after midnight on January 6th. By the third day, crossing the Biscay, the storm found her. It started with water finding paths it should not have had. Combers swept the deck, tore loose fittings, and hammered the scuppers. Coal carried on deck washed, shifted, and choked the drains until the sea that boarded could not leave. Each new wave added a layer. The ship answered sluggishly as her freeboard diminished with every minute. Down below, seawater plunged through opened gratings and into the engine spaces. Firemen fought to keep the furnaces alive. Wet coal hissed and died. When the main engine stopped, the London lost her heart and her way at once. Martin ordered her about to try for Plymouth. Some later would argue that in turning he re-entered the worst of the weather he had already punched through. In the moment, he could see only the decks awash and feel the thud of waves crushing forward. The foretopmast went by the board. The jib boom snapped. A second sea carried away a boat. A third took rails and skylight glass. Another smashed the engine hatch, driving water straight into the works. The ship labored, falling off the seas, her bow slow to lift. Below, stewards sloshed through corridors, hammering on cabin doors to drive passengers up into the open air. Families crowded under the break of the poop and along the companionways. Some tried to gather trunks or the small cases with their valuables. Officers shouted them back. The London had a reputation for carrying prosperous travelers and prominent names. Among them, this trip was the Irish actor Gustavus Vaughan Brooke, clergy bound for the colonies, businessmen, and families returning to Australia after visits home. Now, the list of names vanished into streaming darkness and the need to hold on. As the afternoon reached its low light, a lull gave room for one decision. If the ship would not live, then boats must. But most had already been stove or blown out. Crews tried to clear another and had it smashed the instant the falls took the weight. The hands went at the cutter in the lee. Men grunted in the cold and gullies of water, axes ringing on frozen pins, lines whipped loose, a yard swung and nearly crushed the lot of them. The boat struck the surface, filled, rose, emptied, and somehow held. A handful dropped into her as a sea rolled the London sideways. Others hesitated, eyes on their families and the long black water between them and a chance. On the main deck, passengers gathered with the chaplain. A voice began, "Rock of Ages," and more joined than could hold the tune. The hymn carried in snatches between gusts and the hard hiss of blown spray. Above them, the ship's bows rose and fell like a wounded animal. The crew dragged at the pumps, though the effort was beyond human help now. Water already gurgled at the edge of the gratings. In the near dark, a lantern haloed a single circle of faces, pale and set, husbands holding wives, a child pressed to a mother's skirt. There was nothing theatrical in the moment, only the blunt fact of a ship giving way underfoot. Night closed in with the wind veering and a bitter rain. The cutter drifted near the quarter, men bailing with hats, their oars useless against the beam seas. They heard the London groan, then a long, deep rush of air as if the ship herself took a last breath. The stern rose. The bows pointed down until the keel showed black in a sheet of foam. Those still on deck were driven forward by the force of air blasting from the hatchways as she went. The great hull slid under. Where she had been there was a spinning hole in the sea and then only wreckage on the black water. 19 souls were in the cutter when the ship vanished, mostly crew, 3 of them passengers. They sat half frozen and half drowned, no food, little water, every few minutes bracing to keep the sea from tumbling them out. Hands numbed, they bailed. One man prayed without stopping, another cursed, then apologized, then fell silent. At dawn, the weather eased by a notch. The men saw nothing at first, only an iron-gray loneliness. By afternoon, a bark hove out of the squalls, the Marianaple by later accounts, close enough at last to see the cutter's frantic wave of a coat on an oar. They were hauled up like sacks and carried to Falmouth. Behind them, 220 others did not come home. In London and across Britain, shock gave way to anger. The owners had a sterling name, the crew had good reports, and yet the stories from the survivors told of a ship too low in the water, overloaded with heavy cargo, and burdened with coal on deck, that, once it shifted, helped clog the very drains meant to save her. The Board of Trade opened an inquiry. Testimony picked apart the hours. The decision to turn back toward Plymouth. The time the engine fires failed. How many boats had been serviceable. Whether cargo or fuel storage made the vessel crank, stiff in a way that becomes deadly when free water sloshes on deck. Bit by bit, a picture formed of small margins erased until they became one catastrophe. Names from the passenger list turned the disaster into faces. The Reverend Daniel Draper and his wife among the lost, Professor John Woolley, principal of the University of Sydney. Families whose last letters home mentioned the cold, the excitement, and plans in Melbourne. In the weeks that followed, odd reports drifted in. Bottles found on the French coast with notes that claimed to be from the dying, scrawled with, "The ship is sinking." No hope, whether every bottle was genuine or grief's invention, hardly mattered. The country had already decided the cost was intolerable. If any good arrived after, it came slowly. The case of the London, public and undeniable, fed the campaign against dangerously loaded ships. Samuel Plimsoll, a coal merchant turned reformer, would become the name associated with the mark on a ship's side showing a safe load line. Parliament would argue for years, but the image of a fine steamer drowned under its own weight stuck. Insurers asked harder questions. Surveyors peered more closely at deck cargo stacked just because there was space enough to lash it down. No memorial could restore the dead, but lines of paint and rules in books could keep other names from joining them. For the people who survived, the facts were simpler and could not be shaken loose. The cutter's wet thwarts, the cold that made hands clawed things, the white rim of foam that told them, in the purest language a seafarer knows, that a big ship had just been there and was now gone. For those on land, the story carried something else, a picture of a storm night, a hymn, a captain fighting a losing pattern of cause and effect, and the last sight of families gathered under a lantern as a sea ran the length of a deck already level with the water. The Bay of Biscay has swallowed greater tonnage and more famous names. Still, ask along the Australian route, and the London is spoken as a turning point, one of those losses that forced change. In maritime offices, the inquiries are written out in dry lines, but in churchyards from Exeter to Melbourne, the dates and names stand in stone. They tell you exactly when a January gale met a ship with too little margin left, and how quickly a voyage becomes a verdict when the drains are choked, the fires die, and distance from shelter is measured in hours you no longer have. That is where the SS London remains, on a winter sea, engine silent, a cutter scraping paint from her side, a crew hauling falls with numb hands, while families refuse to push ahead of one another into the one boat that may live. The hymn rises and falls. A steward makes his last trip up the companion. The captain looks aft and reads the deck by the way the water lies everywhere it should not. He orders what can be ordered and then watches, like everyone else, as the ship settles, breathes out, and goes. Thank you for listening to the Sunken Ledger. Subscribe for more true stories from the depths.